The basement of Seoul National University's psychology department smelled like old paper and forgotten dreams. Do-hyun wiped dust from his glasses as he sorted through another box of archived materials. His thesis deadline was approaching, and he needed something unique to write about. The clock showed 11:30 p.m. when his hand brushed against something metal. A film reel wrapped in brown paper and tied with faded string. The label read Project Mirror, Test Sequence 1, 1974. Do-hyun frowned. He hadn't found any mention of this project in the department's research records. The paper wrapping contained a notebook. The handwriting was neat but rushed, as if the writer had been racing against time. Subject shows increased sensitivity to visual stimuli after viewing sequence. Reports seeing shadows where none exist. Further testing required. The entry was signed by Professor Kim Ji-ho. Do-hyun knew that name. Professor Kim had been a rising star in behavioral psychology during the 1970s, famous for his work on human perception. Then one day, he simply vanished. No resignation letter, no body, no explanation. Just an empty office and a lot of questions. Setting up the old projector took an hour. Do-hyun's hands shook as he threaded the film. The basement wall served as his screen. The projector hummed to life, and images flickered in the darkness. At first, it seemed like standard psychological test footage. A room with white walls. A chair. A subject facing the camera. But something was wrong with the angles. The corners of the room didn't meet where they should. The subject's face was calm, but their eyes tracked something moving off-screen. The footage changed. Abstract patterns flowed across the screen, but they hurt to look at. Not because they were bright or fast, but because they seemed to move in ways that shapes shouldn't be able to move. Do-hyun felt his mind trying to make sense of what he was seeing and failing. A high-pitched sound began to play. Not loud, but persistent, like the echo of a scream that hadn't happened yet. Do-hyun's head started to ache. He reached for the projector switch, but his hand froze halfway. In the corner of his vision, something moved. When he turned his head, nothing was there. But in the darkness beyond the projection light, the shadows seemed deeper than they should be. More solid, almost like they were watching him. The film ended abruptly. Do-hyun sat in the darkness, his heart racing. The rational part of his brain listed all the ways fear could trick the mind. Eye strain, suggestion, sleep deprivation. But another part of him, a part that operated on instinct rather than reason, knew he had stumbled onto something important, something dangerous. His phone showed 3 missed calls from his roommate. 2 hours had passed since he started the film, but it had felt like 20 minutes. As he packed up the reel and notebook, his hand brushed against another folder. Inside was a list of test subjects and notes about their reactions. At the bottom of the page, underlined twice, success rate, 15%. Subjects showing desired perceptual shift, 3 of 20. Beginning phase 2 with selected subjects. Do-hyun copied everything onto his phone. As he climbed the stairs back to the main floor, he felt the shadows move again. This time, when he turned, he caught a glimpse of something sliding back into darkness. Something that looked like a hand, but with too many joints. He told himself it was just his imagination. He almost believed it. But that night, as he lay in bed reviewing the footage on his laptop, he noticed something in the background of the test room. A mirror on the wall showed the subject sitting in the chair, but their reflection was standing. The film studies department was quieter than the psychology building. Hae-yeon sat at her desk, replaying Do-hyun's footage frame by frame. Her small office was filled with old movie posters and film equipment. 3 empty coffee cups sat beside her computer. "Look at this," she said, pointing to her screen. "The film grain is wrong. It changes pattern every 12 frames, but old film stock doesn't do that. Someone edited this footage very carefully." Do-hyun leaned closer. The patterns Hae-yeon had spotted seemed to form shapes just at the edge of recognition, like faces emerging from static, only to vanish when you tried to focus on them. There's something else, Hyun continued. The audio track has frequencies that shouldn't be there. Not just the high-pitched noise you heard, but layers of sound below human hearing range. I had to use special software to find them. She played the modified audio. Deep, rhythmic pulses filled the room. They made Do-hyun's teeth hurt and his vision blur. Hyun quickly turned it off. Whatever this is, she said, it was designed to affect the brain. Not just through fear or suggestion, but through direct sensory manipulation. Do-hyun shared Professor Kim's notes with her. They spent hours cross-referencing dates and names, building a timeline on Hyun's whiteboard. The professor had tested his films on 20 subjects. 3 showed what he called expanded perception. 2 went insane. 1 disappeared. We need to find the other reels, Hyun said. The notes mentioned 7 more, each one supposedly more powerful than the last. They searched the university archives together. In the psychology building's storage room, they found an old box with Professor Kim's name. Inside was a map of Seoul with locations marked in red ink. Most were crossed out, but 3 circles remained. The first location was an old movie theater in the city's north end. It had closed years ago, but the building still stood. As they approached it that evening, Do-hyun noticed the shadows were wrong again. They stretched toward the theater's entrance instead of away from the setting sun. Inside, the air was thick with dust and decay. Their flashlights revealed torn screens and broken seats. Hyun found the projection booth first. The room was small, but the walls were covered with bizarre diagrams. Circles within circles, filled with symbols neither of them recognized. In a hidden panel behind a projector, they found another reel. This one was labeled Project Mirror, Test Sequence 2, Perception Boundaries. But they weren't alone. As they were leaving, they heard footsteps on the theater's upper level. An old man stood watching them. His clothes were dirty and his eyes were wild, but he spoke clearly. I was there, he said. I helped him make them. The films, they show you what's always been there, what's always been watching. He introduced himself as Sang-min, Professor Kim's research assistant. Before they could question him further, he turned and ran. They chased him up the stairs, but he vanished. When they checked the spot where he had stood, they found an old ID card. The photo showed a much younger Sang-min, and the date showed 1974. That night, both Do-hyun and Hyun dreamed of circles. Endless circles that spun and merged and pulled them deeper into something vast and patient and hungry. Finding Sang-min wasn't easy. He lived nowhere and everywhere, drifting between homeless shelters and abandoned buildings. Do-hyun and Hyun spent a week showing his picture to people on the streets before getting a solid lead. They found him in an old warehouse, surrounded by newspaper clippings and hand-drawn copies of the strange circular diagrams from the theater. The walls of his living space were covered in tin foil. He sat in the center of a circle made of salt. You watched it, didn't you? Sang-min asked, not looking up from his drawings. The first reel. And now you see them too. The things in the corners of your eyes. Do-hyun stepped forward. What were you and Professor Kim really doing? What was Project Mirror? Sang-min laughed, but there was no joy in it. Mirrors don't just reflect, you know. They're windows. The right mirror, shown the right image, can open, and things can come through. His hand shook as he drew another circle. Hyun pulled out her tablet and showed him the footage they'd found. Sang-min screamed and knocked the device away. Don't. They'll see you looking. They'll know you know. After he calmed down, Sang-min told them about the experiments, how Professor Kim had discovered certain combinations of images and sounds could change how the human brain processed reality, how they'd tested hundreds of sequences before finding the right pattern. The professor said we were making first contact, Sang-min whispered, but we weren't reaching out. They were reaching in, using our own minds against us. The films, they're like keys, turning in locks we didn't know we had in our heads. While they talked, Do-hyun noticed something odd. Sang-min's shadow didn't match his movements. Sometimes it moved a fraction of a second too late. Sometimes it moved when Sang-min was still. The other reels, Hae-hyun pressed. Where are they? Sang-min pulled out a dirty notebook. I mapped them. After what happened to the professor. Had to hide them. Break them up. Too dangerous together. He tore out a page and handed it to them. More locations were marked, along with cryptic notes. But you can't stop it now, Sang-min said. You've seen too much. They've seen you seeing them. Next time you sleep, next time you look in a mirror. His voice trailed off as he stared at something behind them. Do-hyun and Hae-hyun turned. Nothing was there. When they looked back, Sang-min was gone. The salt circle was scattered. His drawings remained, but now the circles seemed to shift on the paper, spinning slowly like tiny whirlpools of ink. That night, Do-hyun woke to find his room full of mirrors he didn't own. When he turned on the light, they vanished. But in the morning, he found salt scattered across his floor, forming a perfect circle around his bed. May-rae lived in a house with no mirrors. The windows were covered with thick black paper. Every light bulb was wrapped in red cloth to dull its shine. She opened the door before Do-hyun, and Hae-hyun could knock. I knew you'd come, she said. They showed me. Her eyes never focused on one spot, constantly moving as if tracking invisible movements in the air. You have questions about the films. Inside, the walls were painted with the same circular patterns they'd seen in Sang-min's hideout. But these were bigger, more complex. They seemed to pulse in the dim red light. I was subject number 7, May-rae said. One of the 3 who saw what Professor Kim wanted us to see. What they wanted us to see. She sat in a chair facing the wall, refusing to look directly at her visitors. The films changed how our brains work, she continued. Like tuning a radio to pick up new stations. At first, we only saw them in reflections, then in shadows, then everywhere. Her hands moved constantly, drawing circles in the air. Hae-hyun took out her notebook. What exactly did you see? May-rae laughed softly. They're not things you can describe with words. They exist in shapes our minds weren't built to understand. Angles that can't exist. Colors that don't have names. She paused. But they've always been here, walking through our world like we walk through a flat paper drawing. Do-hyun felt a headache building behind his eyes. The circular patterns on the walls seemed to be moving faster. What happened to the other subjects? Subject 4 jumped from his building, but his body was never found. Subject 12 locked herself in a room of mirrors. When they broke down the door, the mirrors were shattered, but each piece showed a different reflection. May-rae's voice dropped to a whisper. Subject 15 is still in the hospital. He keeps trying to tear out his eyes, saying they're not his anymore. And Professor Kim? Hae-hyun asked. May-rae turned to face them for the first time. Her eyes were completely black. He found what he was looking for. The final sequence. The one that doesn't just let you see them, but lets you become like them. She smiled, and her teeth seemed too sharp. He's still here. Watching. Waiting. Sometimes I see him in the spaces between spaces. As they left, May-rae called out one last time. You've started watching the sequences, haven't you? Then you already know you can't stop. They won't let you stop. Check your phone's photo gallery. They like to leave little gifts. In the car, Do-hyun checked his phone. Among his recent photos were dozens of images he hadn't taken. Each one showed him sleeping, taken from different angles in his room. In every picture, something dark stood in the corner, watching. Do-hyun spread all their evidence across his apartment floor. Photos, notes, film stills, and maps formed a giant puzzle. Hae-hyun sat cross-legged beside him, comparing the patterns they'd collected from each location. Look at this, she said, placing May-rae's drawings next to Sang-min's. They're not random. It's a sequence, like DNA code. Each circle adds to the previous one. She pulled out her laptop and opened the video analysis software. The same pattern appears in the films, hidden in the grain. Do-hyun's head hurt constantly now. The shadows in his room had grown bolder. They moved even in full light, reaching toward him with long, thin fingers. Every reflective surface showed him glimpses of places that couldn't exist. The test subjects, he said, checking his notes. Each one developed different abilities. Mei-Ray sees them directly. Sang-min knows where they'll appear. Subject 15. He sees through their eyes. Hae-yun pointed to Professor Kim's research diary. He planned this. The films aren't just showing us something. They're changing our brains, teaching us a new language, a language of shapes and angles that lets us perceive their world. The lights flickered. In the brief darkness, both saw tall, thin figures standing in the corners. When the lights steadied, the figures were gone. But new papers had appeared among their research, pages of notes written in Professor Kim's handwriting, dated last week. "They've been here all along," Do-hyun read aloud. "Living in the spaces we can't see, moving through dimensions we can't perceive. But they're curious about us. They want us to learn, to understand, to evolve." Hae-yun's hands shook as she filmed the new pages with her phone. But when she played back the video, the papers were blank. In the background of the video, something huge and dark moved across Do-hyun's ceiling. "We need to find the rest of the reels," Do-hyun said. "The pattern's incomplete. Each film is like a piece of a key, and we need all of them to understand what Professor Kim discovered." That night, they dreamed the same dream. They stood in a vast space where geometry had no meaning. Countless eyes watched them from angles that shouldn't exist, and in the distance, a familiar figure beckoned. Professor Kim, but changed. His body bent in impossible ways, and his smile contained too many dimensions. When they woke, they found their research arranged in a perfect spiral on the floor. At its center lay a map showing the location of Professor Kim's private lab. The map was drawn in ink that moved like living mercury, forming and reforming those endless, maddening circles. Professor Kim's private lab was hidden beneath an old government building. The elevator shaft had been sealed, but Do-hyun and Hae-yun found another way in through the maintenance tunnels. Their flashlights revealed walls covered in mirrors, each one draped with black cloth. The main room was a perfect circle. Film equipment lay scattered everywhere, covered in decades of dust. In the center stood a single projector, still loaded with a reel. The label read Project Mirror, Final Sequence. "Look at this," Hae-yun said, opening a metal filing cabinet. Inside were stacks of official documents, government funding, military oversight. They weren't just studying perception. They were developing a weapon. Do-hyun found the professor's personal logs in a locked drawer. The final entries were frantic, excited. "The human brain is a receiver," he read aloud. "We see and hear only a tiny band of reality. But with the right sequence of stimuli, we can tune it to new frequencies. They taught me how. They've been teaching us since we first looked up at the stars." The documents revealed a pattern. Every major breakthrough in human history had been guided. The symbols that appeared in ancient caves, the geometries of sacred architecture, the mathematical constants that seemed too perfect to be natural. All were parts of a vast pattern, a lesson repeated across millennia. Hae-yun set up her laptop to copy the film reels. As the first one played, the mirrors began to vibrate. Do-hyun saw movement in them, even through their covers. Something was pressing against the glass from the other side. "The government shut it down," he said, reading further. "They thought they were stopping an invasion, but they didn't understand. It was never about invasion. It was about evolution." A final note fell from the journal, written in shaking hand. "They don't want our world. They want us to see their world, the real world, that exists in the spaces between seconds and the angles between dimensions. We're like blind men living in a painting, never knowing that reality has depth." The projector turned on by itself. Images flickered across the wall, shapes that hurt to look at, patterns that made Do-hyun's mind feel like it was unfolding. Hei-yun tried to turn it off, but her hand passed through the switch as if it wasn't there. In the mirrors, they saw Professor Kim watching them, but he wasn't human anymore. His form twisted through impossible geometries, beautiful and terrible. When he spoke, his voice came from everywhere and nowhere. "Now you understand," he said. "This was never about horror. Horror is just the mind's reaction to seeing truth it wasn't ready for. But you're ready now. You've followed the pattern. Look." And they looked, and they saw. And they finally understood why some knowledge changes you forever. Do-hyun couldn't sleep anymore. When he closed his eyes, he saw through walls. Time moved strangely around him, sometimes fast, sometimes slow, sometimes sideways. Hei-yun wasn't doing much better. Her videos now showed places that didn't exist, and her voice echoed from multiple directions at once. They met in his apartment to review their findings. The walls breathed softly around them. Reality felt thin, like tissue paper ready to tear. "Look at this," Hei-yun said, her voice coming from both her mouth and the shadows behind her. She played the final reel they'd found in the lab. The films weren't recording experiments. They were the experiment. Each viewing changes the viewer's brain patterns. It's like installing new software in our minds. Do-hyun watched his coffee cup fill itself from empty to full without anyone touching it. The government files said they were looking for people who could perceive higher dimensions. But why? Because they're already here. Hei-yun pointed to her laptop screen. In the video footage, shapes moved in patterns that shouldn't be possible. These beings, they exist in dimensions we can't naturally see. The films are like training wheels, teaching us to see properly for the first time. Do-hyun's perception shifted. For a moment, he saw the room as they did, a complex web of intersecting planes where time was just another direction to move in. He saw Hei-yun existing in multiple moments simultaneously, her past and future overlapping like pages in a book. "We have to make a choice," he said, his words leaving visible ripples in the air. Professor Kim's final notes. He found a way to fully transform, to exist as they do. But he warns that humanity might not be ready. Hei-yun's form flickered. In some moments she was fully human, in others her shape twisted into beautiful impossibilities. I've been seeing them clearly now. They're not hostile. They're like teachers, waiting for us to graduate from a two-dimensional understanding of reality. The room filled with soft light from no particular source. In every corner, beings watched them with patient, multidimensional eyes. Do-hyun could feel their curiosity, their eagerness to share knowledge that would change humanity forever. "But there's no going back," he said. "Once enough people see the truth, human consciousness will change permanently. We'll stop being what we are and become something else." The choice hung between them like a physical thing, glowing with possibilities. Behind them, a mirror showed Professor Kim beckoning, his form a beautiful masterpiece of impossible geometry. The beings in the corners moved closer, ready to share their secrets. Do-hyun stood in Professor Kim's lab one last time. The film reels lay before him on the table. Hei-yun watched from a corner, her form shifting between human and something gloriously different with each blink. The beings surrounded them now, no longer hiding. Their bodies were symphonies of impossible angles, their movements pure mathematics. They showed Do-hyun visions of what humanity could become, beings of pure thought and endless dimension, freed from the prison of linear time and space. "We don't need the films anymore," Hei-yun said, her voice harmonizing with itself across multiple dimensions. "We can see them now. We can join them." But Do-hyun remembered Miray's black eyes, Sang-min's broken mind, and the other test subjects lost between realities. He thought about his sister, his parents, all the normal humans living their lives in comfortable ignorance of the vast geometries around them. "We're not ready," he said quietly. "Not as a species. This knowledge, it breaks as many minds as it opens. We need to evolve at our own pace." The being showed no anger at his decision. If anything, They seemed pleased, as if his choice was another test, and he had passed. Professor Kim appeared in all the mirrors simultaneously, his transformed shape a testament to what humanity could become. "You understand now," the professor's voice echoed. "True horror isn't in darkness or death. It's in knowing how small we are, how limited our perception is. But that horror can destroy us or transform us. The choice must be ours." Do-hyun gathered the film reels. Hae-yun didn't try to stop him as he set up the projector one last time. But instead of playing the films, he spliced them together and began feeding them through backwards. Reality buckled. The beings watched with infinite patience as Do-hyun reversed the pattern, closed the doors in his mind that the films had opened. Hae-yun's form stabilized, becoming fully human again as the knowledge faded. When it was done, the lab felt smaller, simpler. The mirrors showed only ordinary reflections. But sometimes, when Do-hyun looked very carefully at the space between spaces, he caught glimpses of patient eyes watching humanity's slow climb toward understanding. He left one file in the university archives, a warning written in simple words about knowledge that humanity wasn't ready for. And in the years that followed, when his students asked him about perception and reality, he smiled and told them that truth, like evolution, takes its own time. The beings remained, invisible but present, waiting for the day when humanity would finally be ready to see all the angles of existence. And in quiet moments, Do-hyun knew he had made the right choice, not to deny the truth, but to let humans find it in their own time, in their own way.